The courtroom was packed, suffocating with tension. Rows of spectators leaned forward in their seats. Journalists jockeyed for position at the back with cameras aimed like rifles, and a row of television monitors broadcast the proceedings to a nation watching in real time. This wasn't just another corruption trial. It was the political event of the year. At the center stood Senator Raymond Giles, once hailed as a future presidential contender, now shackled by allegations of embezzling millions in campaign donations. Across the aisle stood Pam Bondi, the formidable federal prosecutor known for her steely resolve, clinical logic, and ruthless pursuit of the truth. Today was supposed to be her victory lap, the moment she brought down a titan of Washington with carefully constructed evidence and unshakable arguments. As she approached the stand, file in hand and gaze fixed, the room held its breath. But before a single exhibit could be entered, the atmosphere shattered. Without warning, Maria Giles, the senator's wife, stood from the gallery, her eyes wild with rage and desperation. Gasps rose as she stormed past court security, who, too stunned to act, simply froze and crossed the courtroom in seconds. Then, in front of the cameras, in front of the judge, in front of the country, she slapped Pam Bondi across the face. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Bondi staggered slightly, caught off guard but not broken. Maria didn't hesitate. Her voice, trembling but defiant, echoed in the stunned silence. "You lied, you destroyed my family, you made it all up." The room erupted. Reporters stood and shouted. Court officers swarmed Maria, pulling her back as she screamed over their shoulders. Photographers clicked wildly. The judge pounded his gavel, calling for order, but there was no containing it. The moment had already gone viral. Within seconds, the footage hit every screen, an explosive breach of courtroom decorum that no one could unsee. For Bondi, it wasn't just a slap. It was the beginning of something far worse. Narrator voice, steady and solemn, cut through the chaos as the camera froze on Bondi's stunned expression. One slap, one accusation, and everything unraveled. Pam Bondi had built her entire career on control. Not just courtroom control, the kind that silences cross-examinations and sways juries with surgical precision, but total, airtight, zero room for error control. She was known in legal circles as the Hammer, a moniker earned not by shouting or theatrics, but by a relentless focus on precision, preparation, and presentation. Bondi didn't lose cases. More importantly, she didn't leave room for doubt. She entered every courtroom with meticulously vetted witnesses, scrubbed timelines, and chain of custody documents verified thrice. She had become a symbol of prosecutorial certainty, the kind of figurehead the Justice Department pointed to when they wanted to assure the public that the system still worked, and in many ways it had, until now. The trial of Senator Raymond Giles was supposed to be another addition to her long list of victories, maybe even the last stop before a senior DOJ appointment. Giles, a savvy political operator with a spotless public image, had long been rumored to play fast and loose with donor money. His polished demeanor and record of bipartisan initiatives had made him a darling of the media, but Bondi's Financial Crimes Division had spent 2 years tracking transfers, digging through shell corporations and building a complex paper trail that tied campaign contributions to private real estate developments. The evidence was thick, the numbers damning, or so it seemed. The senator himself had remained calm throughout the proceedings. His legal team had mounted a soft defense, mostly procedural objections and minimal cross-examinations. Strategies that signaled quiet resignation more than defiance. But it was Maria Giles, his wife, who proved to be the anomaly. Glamorous, articulate, and always 3 steps ahead of the press, Maria had remained publicly silent for the first 3 days of the trial. Then, without warning, she flipped the script. Just hours before the courtroom slap, she had given a brief statement outside the courthouse, an unscheduled, unsanctioned appearance that took even her husband's defense team by surprise. "There are things the prosecution isn't showing you," she said, her voice cold but controlled. "Things that were altered, suppressed. If no one else will say it, I will." At first, Bondi dismissed it as a last-ditch distraction tactic. She had seen it before. Families of powerful defendants lashing out as the evidence tightened. But this felt different. Maria's words weren't desperate. They were surgical, even calculated. Bondi continued with her case, unfazed, relying on the spreadsheet-heavy body of evidence that had carried her this far. But that confidence began to crack, slowly at first, then faster. After the slap, the courtroom chaos gave way to a fog of speculation, and it wasn't long before questions began to multiply. Whispers emerged about a set of edited account summaries, financial documents tied to one of Giles's holding companies. The documents were already part of evidence, but someone began circulating screenshots from an earlier version. One that appeared to include additional line items not present in Bondi's trial exhibits. Online forums lit up. News outlets began requesting comment from the Department of Justice. A financial expert quoted in the Washington Times remarked, "If those omissions are real, this isn't just a prosecutorial oversight, it's misconduct." Bondi tried to regain footing in the courtroom by pressing forward with testimony from her lead forensic accountant. But even there, tensions surfaced. During cross-examination, the defense subtly referenced a possible discrepancy between internal draft reports and final submissions. Bondi's expert, clearly rattled, hesitated for a beat too long when asked if the draft and final matched line for line. "To the best of my knowledge," he finally replied, "we followed the instructions provided to us." That phrase, "instructions provided to us," was all the defense needed. Bondi knew it instantly. She watched the defense attorney glance toward the jury, planting a seed of doubt with nothing more than silence. And still she pressed on. She doubled down on data, on the timeline, on the structures she had spent years building, but her certainty no longer felt impenetrable. It felt brittle. Outside the courtroom, Maria Giles didn't back down either. In interviews, she remained cryptic but unwavering. "They thought no one would question her because she was flawless," Maria told a reporter. But perfection often hides the most dangerous cracks. The media, smelling blood, began spinning a new narrative. Bondi, once the unshakable enforcer of justice, was now being portrayed as a woman too obsessed with winning to notice when the truth no longer aligned with her argument. Editorials split. Some called Maria's actions manipulative and theatrical. Others hailed her as the first person to challenge an unchecked force of legal power. But inside Bondi's own team, uncertainty had begun to settle. A junior staffer asked whether the original forensic analysis had been independently verified. Another questioned why the metadata on several PDF files showed timestamps inconsistent with their supposed entry date. Bondi didn't lash out, she didn't panic, but she knew the tide was shifting. The certainty she had weaponized for her entire career was being turned against her, not by incompetence or fabrication, but by something far more dangerous, a single error, a single omission buried under layers of perfection, and a woman bold enough to call it out in front of the world. The foundation wasn't cracking, it was already broken. She just hadn't looked down yet. The slap echoed far beyond the courtroom. Within hours, the clip of Maria Giles striking Pam Bondi had amassed over 20 million views across every major platform. News networks ran it on repeat, splicing it between headlines that shifted from legal analysis to pure spectacle. Senator's wife attacks prosecutor, Pam Bondi stunned in courtroom showdown, cracks in the hammer's armor. But the virality didn't just spread, it metastasized. The moment, visceral and public, became a symbol of something deeper. A confrontation not just between two women, but between power and its presumed infallibility. Bondi's name, once synonymous with precision and justice, was now the center of a national reckoning. That reckoning escalated when Eli Brenner, a junior forensic accountant assigned to Bondi's case, filed a whistleblower report. Quiet, soft-spoken, and barely 30, Brenner had worked under Bondi's team for less than a year, but his affidavit landed like a bomb. In it, he claimed he had been pressured to revise his analysis of the Giles campaign finances, specifically to emphasize discrepancies that, in his professional opinion, were inconclusive. "I was asked to format the data to align with the prosecution's timeline," he wrote, "not falsify, but frame." And that distinction is where everything started to erode. The media seized on the language immediately, framed, not falsified. Within 24 hours, the FBI confirmed they had opened an inquiry into Bondi's handling of evidence in the Giles case. By the next morning, she had been placed on administrative leave, her DOJ credentials suspended pending internal review. The news broke live while pundits were still dissecting Brenner's claims. Pam Bondi, the Hammer, the architect of high-profile convictions, the woman who once lectured on prosecutorial ethics, was now being investigated by the very system she had served for decades. The response was swift and cold. Colleagues who once praised her strategy and poise issued brief, non-committal statements about respecting due process. Her team splintered. One senior assistant quietly resigned. Another removed Bondi's name from his LinkedIn profile. Behind closed doors, the Justice Department scrambled to insulate itself, initiating a parallel review of other cases she had prosecuted in recent years. The question wasn't just whether Bondi had overstepped. It was whether a culture of winning at all costs had metastasized under her leadership. Editorial pages, once filled with admiration, turned acidic. When prosecutors go too far, from justice to justification. Bondi, a case study in collapse. Commentators debated whether her fall was a cautionary tale or a long overdue correction. Meanwhile, Bondi said nothing. She issued no press release, no public defense. She didn't deny Brenner's claims, but neither did she admit fault. Her silence became its own story, an echo chamber of suspicion. The woman who had built her brand on dominance was now defined by absence. Outside her DC apartment, reporters waited around the clock. Neighbors whispered. Anonymous tips flooded tip lines, many unverified but all damaging. A photograph of Bondi entering a side door with her head down became a symbol of reversal. The prosecutor now hiding from scrutiny, the hunter now the hunted. Even Maria Giles, once dismissed as a grieving wife protecting her husband, was rebranded by the press as a whistleblower in pearls, a woman who dared to slap the system and made it blink. But the cruelest shift came from within. Bondi's own belief in her incorruptibility began to crack. Alone in her apartment, surrounded by boxes of files, notes, and red-marked timelines, she replayed the interviews, re-examined the documents. And for the first time, she saw the things she had refused to, the overlooked footnotes, the inconsistencies in metadata, the assumptions that had been cemented as facts. Not lies, but shortcuts. Not fabrications, but filtered truths. She had always believed in the case, she still did, but now she was forced to confront the question she had avoided for too long. Had she won so often that she stopped asking if she should? The fall wasn't dramatic. It was silent. No explosion, just erosion. Pam Bondi had not yet been convicted of anything, but in the court of public opinion, the verdict had come early. The hammer had fallen, and it had landed on her. Pam Bondi disappeared. After her suspension, she didn't return calls. She didn't brief her legal team. She didn't open her inbox or look at her phone. She went home, to a silent, modern apartment in the heart of DC, once a command center of schedules and strategy, now a tomb of unopened files and unanswered questions. For days, she sat with nothing but her case binders, her doubts, and her silence. No cameras, no courtroom, just her, and the fragments of a reputation that once felt invincible. She began doing what she hadn't done in months, reading the case like it wasn't hers, like she hadn't written the opening statement or vetted every chart. And that's when she found it. Deep in an old thread between her and a junior assistant, time-stamped 2 days before her final presentation to the court, there was a single line, buried in a reply. Should I reformat the budget flow for consistency before the hearing? Pam stared at the wording, the passive suggestion, the careful ambiguity. Reformat. Consistency. It wasn't an admission, but it wasn't nothing. She pulled the original attachments, ran metadata checks, checked versions, and what she found wasn't damning, but it was enough. The budget sheet presented in court had been streamlined, one column removed, a line item buried. The total was the same, but the context was not. Somewhere along the way, accuracy had become efficiency, and she'd let it happen, not by order, but by culture. That was the part she couldn't deny. She didn't need to tamper with evidence. Her team was so focused on delivering victory that they reshaped the narrative without being told. And she, trusting in the outcome, never asked the question she should have. Is this still the whole truth? That realization sent her out of the apartment. For the first time in a week, she called Eli Brenner. He didn't answer. She tried again. On the third attempt, he picked up. "I'll give you 15 minutes, he said. They met in a dim, half-empty cafe near DuPont Circle. Eli arrived in a hoodie and worn jeans, eyes dark from lack of sleep, but steady. Bondi offered no apology, no rehearsed defense. She simply asked, "Why didn't you come to me first?" Eli didn't flinch. "Because I did," he replied. "Not in so many words, but I flagged things. I questioned the draft. You didn't listen," she nodded quietly. He continued, "You wanted the win so badly. You didn't ask what it cost. You didn't ask what it would cost me." That last sentence stung deeper than she expected. Because it was true, Eli had been collateral damage in a case meant to be flawless. And in protecting her own structure, she'd left others exposed. "I believe the case was real," she said finally. "I still do." Eli leaned back. "It probably is. But you stopped checking, and that's when it became yours, not the truth's." They parted without a handshake, without reconciliation. But as she walked back into the cold evening air, Bondi felt something shift. This wasn't just about repairing her name. This was about something harder, owning what had gone unspoken. She couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could do something no one expected from someone like her. Admit where it went wrong, and start from there. The shift began with a leak. Just when the news cycle seemed ready to move on from Pam Bondi's unraveling, a confidential internal memo surfaced. An administrative communication between Bondi and her senior staff dated 11 days before the Giles trial began. It was stamped "Review Complete," and it bore her initials in the bottom corner. The contents were damning. The document attached to the memo was the finalized version of the financial report used in court, the same report now under scrutiny for omissions and formatting inconsistencies. The memo included a short message: "Use this version for the official binder. Keep layout clean. No need for irrelevant outliers, PV." It wasn't a command to falsify, but it was clearly an instruction to streamline, to present something tighter, cleaner, more digestible, the kind of version that wins. And Bondi had signed off. When the memo hit the press, the backlash was immediate. Headlines screamed, "Pam Bondi knew. Federal star prosecutor sanctioned cleaner data before trial. Did she cross the line or just blur it?" Overnight, the tone surrounding her case shifted from caution to condemnation. Public trust didn't just crack. It seemed to collapse entirely. Former colleagues issued careful statements. Legal experts condemned her judgment, and in newsrooms across the country, the narrative sharpened. This wasn't just a fall from grace. It was self-inflicted. But then the unexpected happened. Eli Brenner, the forensic accountant who had triggered the investigation, stepped forward again, this time not to accuse, but to clarify. In a statement released through his attorney, Eli revealed that he had kept the original version of the financial analysis, the unedited, raw data set that had never made it into the courtroom. It was saved offline, archived for his own records, never deleted. And crucially, it contained every line item that had been removed for presentation purposes. The data wasn't forged, it wasn't altered, it had been filtered, but not destroyed. There was still a complete record of the truth. When Bondi learned of the file's existence, she didn't hesitate. She drafted a letter to the FBI, attached the raw report, and submitted it herself. But she didn't stop there. That same afternoon, she held a brief press conference, the first since her suspension. No teleprompter, no DOJ backdrop, just a podium on the Capitol steps, a handful of cameras, and a statement. "I authorized the presentation of a report that, while technically accurate, did not reflect the full scope of financial activity," she began. "That was a failure in judgment, not just as a prosecutor but as a steward of the public's trust. The original report was preserved. It has now been submitted in full to federal investigators. I accept responsibility for not insisting that it be presented in its entirety." She paused. "Truth is not a curated version of events. It is whole or it is nothing." Reporters stood stunned. There was no spin, no deflection, no counterattack. Pam Bondi had just done the one thing no one expected. She turned herself in, not for a crime, but for a breach of duty. And the effect was immediate. Within hours, the narrative shifted again, not to redemption, but to reflection. Opinion columns wrestled with the complexity. She didn't fabricate. She failed to resist the urge to perfect. There's a difference and a lesson. Pundits debated whether her confession was genuine or strategic, but in the public square, a new voice began to emerge, not of defense, but of understanding. A former prosecutor tweeted, "We are taught to win, not to admit we should have lost a point along the way. What she did today took more strength than I've seen from this system in years." A law professor posted a thread titled, "Pam Bondi and the Anatomy of Accountability." Even some critics acknowledged the rarity of what she had done, not just taking blame, but actively participating in exposing her own blind spots. Public sentiment didn't turn in her favor exactly, but it softened. She was no longer the hammer, no longer the villain. She was something more unsettling, a human being caught in the gray zone between principle and pressure. Her actions had consequences, but so did her admission. The DOJ extended its investigation, but paused any decision about permanent disbarment, pending review of her cooperation. Some called it grace, others called it politics, but no one could deny one thing. Pam Bondi had detonated the case herself. And in doing so, she cracked open a conversation far larger than one woman or one trial. What happens when the people who protect the truth start editing it? For the first time in weeks, the public didn't turn away from her, they leaned in. The fallout from the Bondi case didn't end with her confession. It rippled through the justice system like a tectonic shift. Within 2 weeks of her public admission and the submission of the original unedited report, the Department of Justice announced the launch of an independent audit, not just of the Giles case, but of federal prosecution protocols nationwide. The review focused on a specific, often ignored corner of legal process: how forensic evidence, particularly financial analysis, is collected, cleaned, and presented in federal court. What began as a high-profile ethics probe into one prosecutor evolved into a full-scale investigation into systemic blind spots. A preliminary report from the Office of the Inspector General sent shockwaves through the legal community. It revealed that at least 7 federal cases over the past 5 years involved some form of data shaping, a term used to describe technically permissible but ethically ambiguous edits to financial evidence made before trial. In each instance, key facts were left intact, but surrounding context had been narrowed, often to support a cleaner narrative. The cases weren't criminally compromised, but they were morally compromised, just enough to spark a national debate. News outlets took up the cause. Editorials published under headlines like, "When the Truth is Tidied, the Ethics of Streamlining," and "Did we incentivize the wrong kind of prosecutor?" Experts were called to testify before Senate committees. Law school panels scrambled to host emergency lectures on prosecutorial integrity. And behind all of it stood the notorious Bondi case, a single prosecution that had cracked open an entire method of justice. Facing mounting pressure, a bipartisan group of senators introduced sweeping legislation called the Financial Evidence Re-Verification Act, nicknamed the Bondi Clause. The bill proposed a simple but profound change. In any federal case involving financial data, all forensic accounting reports would be required to undergo dual certification, one by the prosecution's analyst and another by an independent third-party reviewer unaffiliated with the case. Additionally, all metadata records of document changes would be submitted to the court alongside the report, ensuring transparency from the first draft to the final exhibit. In the past, such reform would have been politically dead on arrival, but now it moved swiftly through committee. Public support surged. Even federal judges, long resistant to procedural overhaul, acknowledged the need for clarity. In a rare statement, the Federal Judicial Conference admitted, "We must ask hard questions about how we present facts, not just whether those facts are technically correct, but whether they serve the full spirit of justice." And Pam Bondi, stripped of her title, barred temporarily from courtroom work and still under review by the bar, she received an invitation that no one expected. The National Commission on Justice Integrity, a newly formed panel tasked with guiding reform in prosecutorial standards, asked her to join as a senior policy advisor. The decision was controversial. Critics argued she should not be rewarded with influence after her role in the scandal, but others saw it differently. One commissioner, speaking off the record, said it best: "She broke the glass, but she also had the courage to admit she was holding the hammer. That kind of clarity doesn't come often. We'd be foolish not to listen." Bondi accepted the invitation not out of ambition, but out of something quieter, an obligation to repair what she had helped erode. In closed-door sessions, she spoke candidly about her blind spots, the pressure to win, the culture of unspoken expectations that governed high-stakes prosecution. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for systems that wouldn't require perfection to prevent collapse. The press began referring to her not as the hammer anymore, but as the mirror. Not a punisher, but a reflector. Not a leader, but a cautionary tale with purpose. Her presence in the room lent the commission credibility, but more importantly, urgency. Reform was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, a before and after, and slowly the culture began to shift. New training modules for federal prosecutors were drafted using transcripts of the Bondi hearing. Legal ethics curricula at top universities integrated the case as a study in complexity, not villainy. Panels were held titled Failure, Accountability, and the Future of Justice. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was something rarer, a reckoning that stuck. And for once, the system didn't just absorb the scandal and move on, it absorbed the lesson. In one of her first sessions with the Reform Committee, Bondi was asked by a junior advisor what it felt like to lose everything in front of the nation. She paused for a long time, then answered quietly, "I didn't lose everything. I lost my image. What I gained was my vision." The room fell silent. For all the damage, the chaos, the headlines, something enduring had emerged. A justice system that was finally willing to look at itself, and the unlikely woman who gave it the reason to. The lecture hall wasn't grand, just a sunlit auditorium tucked inside the law school of a mid-sized university, far from the marble columns and televised courtrooms Pam Bondi once commanded. The rows were filled with second-year students, notebooks open, laptops glowing, eyes sharp with the hunger of those still untouched by disillusionment. There was no entourage when she walked in, no flashing cameras, just a quiet hush of recognition. She no longer wore the tailored navy suits or DOJ pin. Her hair was looser now, her demeanor calmer, no longer built for combat but for clarity. She stepped behind the modest podium and looked out, not at a jury, not at colleagues or critics, but at future lawyers who had studied her fall like a case file. She didn't begin with law, she began with failure. "They say the law is about truth," she said, her voice steady but soft. "But sometimes we forget that the truth doesn't just show up in our exhibits. It shows up in what we choose not to include." The room was silent, no typing, no distractions. She spoke of the Giles case only once, briefly, without justification or defense. What she offered wasn't a retelling, it was a roadmap for what to do when the compass spins. "The fall doesn't define you," she said, meeting the gaze of a student in the front row. "What you do after does." It wasn't a dramatic speech, it wasn't designed to go viral, but it lingered in the air like something heavier than rhetoric, something earned. When the final question was answered and her notes gathered, she didn't linger. She nodded a quiet thank you to the dean and turned toward the door, and as she stepped into the hallway, the camera, there only for archival footage, followed her in a long, slow pan. Students stood, not in ovation, but in stillness. Not in celebration, but in respect. No applause, just understanding. She passed a bulletin board lined with case law articles, and on it someone had tacked a headline from 2 years earlier, "Pam Bondi turns over evidence, turns on herself." Someone had circled the subhead in red pen. "This is what accountability looks like." She paused only for a second, then she kept walking, unhurried, unguarded, unburdened. She exited into the light of a cool afternoon, no cameras waiting outside, just trees rustling in the wind and the low murmur of students dispersing behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The system she once dominated now bore her fingerprints in a different way, not as a symbol of strength, but as a cautionary example of integrity rediscovered. The screen faded to black, and in white letters, steady and unflinching, the final words appeared. She built her name on conviction. She reclaimed it through confession.